Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 795, and today is May 7th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to get into on today's show, so I'm going to quickly just mention to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. Today I will be interviewing our old friend Misty Winston. So we have a lot to talk about and catch up on, and I'm sure that is going to be one hot interview. So you'll definitely want to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show to check that out. It is the first link in the show notes page. All right, let's get into the news we have on today's show. First up here, this one I wrote for the Institute on May 5th. U.S. to upgrade transfer missile defense from Israel to Ukraine. The Donald Trump administration is moving forward with a Joe Biden-era plan to move a retired Patriot missile system from Israel to Ukraine. Washington will upgrade the air defense platform before transferring control to Kiev. The New York Times reported the move on Sunday, citing 4 current and former U.S. officials who confirmed that Trump planned to go through with sending the Patriot system to Kiev, despite his stated objections to continuing what he calls Biden's war in Ukraine. The plan to transfer the Patriot battery would also see Germany or Greece send a second system, giving Kiev a total of 10, though one official said 2 of them are currently not functioning. A Ukrainian official admitted on Friday that his forces lacked adequate air defenses. The Patriot system, set to be transferred from Israel, is an older model that will be upgraded. The U.S. recently deployed a Patriot battery and multiple THAAD air defense systems to the Middle East to defend Israel. The Ukrainian President Zelensky has offered to buy more air defense platforms. Kiev is largely dependent on aid transfers from Washington. However, last week, a natural resource deal between Washington and Kiev was signed that could give Ukraine access to funds to buy more American weapons. Trump met Zelensky at the Vatican during Pope Francis's funeral. The Ukrainian leader left the meeting feeling he had successfully swayed his American counterpart to take a harder line on Russian President Vladimir Putin. Following the meeting, Trump criticized Putin for targeting the Ukrainian cities in a missile attack. And I think this is a little bit of concerning news, that what we are looking at here is the Trump administration, when they do decide, if they decide to walk away from the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, are going to continue the proxy war. The Patriot missile is a major, one of the most advanced systems that the U.S. has sent to Ukraine, and that Trump is going to upgrade and send another one to Kiev isn't anywhere near what he was talking about on the campaign trail about getting the Americans out of this war and ending it. All right, so next up here, it looks like we're going to have a short ceasefire in Ukraine, at least from the Russian side. Russia says it will implement 3-day ceasefire despite Ukraine's rejection. This one from Dade DeCamp, May 6th, antiwar.com. Russian officials said Tuesday that Moscow intends to implement a 3-day truce with Ukraine that starts at midnight on May 8th, but vowed any Ukrainian attacks during that time will be met with a response. The ceasefire will coincide with Russia's celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory against Nazi Germany in World War II. So Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov explained there will be no hostilities. However, if there is no reciprocity from the Kiev regime and they continue to attack our positions, our facilities, we will retaliate. Over the weekend, Zelensky rejected the idea of a 3-day truce, saying it would not help negotiations for a lasting peace, and backed a U.S. proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. And my guess is the difference is a 30-day ceasefire would actually give the Ukrainians time to rearm, to fortify their defensive positions, to be a more capable fighting force against the Russians, where 3 days just doesn't give them that much time. So I'm not surprised that both sides are handling it the way they are. I think for Donald Trump in particular, this is a missed opportunity. I think he probably should have pressured the Ukrainians to agree to this deal and then gone to the Russians and say, if the Ukrainians are abiding by it, and maybe if we implement some other measures to make sure that say the Ukrainians just aren't getting a massive amount of weapons during this time, could we then extend this ceasefire for a week? And then, once we get to a week, then you could go to a month. And so that I think would be a good path to go down. Now, Russia is saying that they don't want a ceasefire, that they want a permanent end to the conflict. And I think while that is an understandable position to have, it's also in the way of a ceasefire deal. And so I think one of the best courses here would be for Trump to have really embraced this 3-day ceasefire, maybe even tried to meet with Putin during this 3-day period, because after all, between Washington and Moscow, our big joint victory was the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. As much as Trump apparently thinks that the Americans were almost all responsible for that, it was the Soviets. And so if the US and the Russians now try to get together and celebrate their common victory from 80 years ago, that may help to foster some diplomacy today. And it doesn't appear that Trump is really interested in going down that road. Now, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, who is planning to attend the parade, also took Zelensky's comments as a threat by basically saying that, Ukraine is going to continue to attack. But I think, that Fico is attending is at least a good sign. And hopefully Trump tries to relay a message to Putin through Fico or somebody on VE Day here tomorrow on May 8th and try to get some kind of use history as a momentum to encourage and facilitate future peace. We will see. I'm not convinced it's going to happen, but it could. All right, next up here, thousands of unexploded Israeli bombs in Gaza provide Hamas with weapons. And so this is a really important story. And this is something that I have been talking about on this show for over a year. And it's one of the reasons that for well over a year, I have been convinced that Israel will not stop their military operations in Gaza. And from Tel Aviv's perspective, they have no choice but to remove the civilian population altogether because they've essentially given Hamas a massive arms stockpile. So, I write, Hamas is using some of the thousands of unexploded bombs that now litter Gaza as weapons against the invading Israeli forces. Most Hamas munitions are crafted from cannibalizing dud bombs dropped by Israel. So, according to the Israeli media, the country's military estimated early this year that there were at least 3,000 unexploded bombs in Gaza. An Israeli officer explained that the munitions will be used by Hamas. They said, the situation we've reached is not normal. Tens of thousands of explosives are lying in Gaza waiting for Hamas. The number of unexploded bombs could be even higher. The IDF has dropped 40,000 bombs on Gaza since October 7, 2023. A typical dud rate is 10%. However, the Israeli military still uses some Vietnam-era missiles, and additionally, they were short on bomb fuses, and so they've used some outdated bomb fuses as well. And according to multiple sources, so this was reported by Haaretz and Reuters, that the dud bomb rate that Israel is using could be as high as 20%, which means 1 in 5 bombs. And so, well, Israel says there's 3,000 unexploded bombs around Gaza. That number seems like it's certainly going to be at the minimum of 4,000, because that would be 10% of the unexploded bombs. Now, maybe Israel has been able to mop up some of these bombs, either through their occupation forces taking territory. They have these armored D9 bulldozers that are out in Gaza constantly trying to remove some of these weapons. And also, I guess if they know an airstrike doesn't go off, they could drop a second bomb on top of it and probably ignite that fuse. Now, another thing that happens with the Israelis in particular in Gaza is they're dropping bombs on rubble, on piles of rubble. And so the structures being hit are not firm enough to ignite the fuse of the bombs and set off, the 500,000, 2,000 pound of explosives in the bombs. At the same time, those bombs just get lodged in the rubble of what were former Palestinian homes. And so, because of that, because of using the old fuses, the dud rate could be as high as 20%, which means there would be 8,000 bombs all across Gaza. Now, Reuters did a pretty extensive investigation into this last month and found that, not, I don't know, a lot, but at least some of the bombs that are unexploded in Gaza are 2,000 pound bombs, MK 80 series bombs. 84s are the Bucker Busters, but I'm sure there's others too that are laying around Gaza. And that is a lot of explosive. That is a lot of weapons. Hamas estimates that the value of the unexploded bombs is in the tens of millions of dollars. So, a former Israeli official explained to the New York Times in January 2024 that Hamas makes most of their munitions from bombs dropped on Gaza that do not detonate. Unexploded ordnance is the main source of explosives for Hamas, said Michael Kardash, the former deputy head of the Israeli National Bomb Police Disposal Division and an Israeli police consultant. They are currently cutting bombs, open bombs from Israel, artillery bombs from Israel, and a lot of them are being used, of course, and repurposed for their explosives and rockets. And so, Israel has carried out compared to the current military operations in Gaza, were fairly minor in 2014 and 2018, and, just every couple of years since, right? But with these new attacks and the amount of bombs being laid down, I'm sure Hamas would have the amount of explosive material needed to produce a massive amount of rockets, RPGs, IEDs, all things that they could use against Israel, not just as the Israeli forces are invading and attempting to occupy Gaza, but if they left to fire back into Israel. So the armed wing of Hamas, the Al-Qassams Brigade, has teams trained to recover the unexploded bombs, including 2,000-pound weapons. It also has the ability to break down the Israeli munitions into rockets or RPGs, and also to raid them into IEDs. Salvaged Israeli bombs have been turned into lethal munitions by Hamas since October 7th. In December of 2023, the remnants of an unexploded Israeli bomb were used to kill 10 Israeli soldiers. Haaretz reported that in January, an IDF tank was destroyed by a Hamas IED created from an unexploded bomb. While Israel has decimated the Strip over the past 19 months, U.S. and Israeli intelligence have acknowledged that Hamas has retained most of its tunnel network and has recruited at least as many fighters as it has lost. Tel Aviv recently announced a mass call-up of its reserve forces and expanded its military operations in Gaza to include the full occupation of the Strip. And so, Netanyahu has created a real problem for himself in Gaza, where from the military perspective, I think there's an argument to make that the Israelis can't leave at this point, that they can't leave all these bombs all over Gaza. Now, you can make a humanitarian argument here as well, and this is important that I bring this up and mention this too, that Israel isn't allowing any bomb clearing equipment into Gaza. And so even humanitarian aid organizations can't begin to remove these bombs from the remnants of people's homes so they could, try to clean up and try to rebuild and try to establish some sort of life in the future. If there's a 500-pound bomb, a 2,000-pound bomb lodged in what was once your home, it would be extremely dangerous to try to clear that without the appropriate equipment, without the appropriate expertise. And so Israel not allowing in humanitarian aid groups and bomb clearing equipment to clear these bombs is a future threat to the civilian population. More so, I think it's a threat to Israel, and that Hamas would, if Israel left, have all the time in the world to clean up these bombs, to take them, to break them down, to turn them into rockets and missiles and RPGs and all other kinds of weapons to use against Israeli forces in the future. But the other problem that Netanyahu has is that if he stays, that Hamas will be able to rig these up into IEDs. And so Israeli forces trying to operate will be blown up, with their own bombs time and time again. What bombs they do recover will be repurposed and reprocessed into RPGs, rockets, and other mortars that will be fired at Israeli forces time and time again. It is going to be extremely difficult for Israel, in large part because they've handed their enemy a massive arsenal to use. And so I do think that this is a reason the Israelis are going to feel that they have to pursue the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza, is because if they leave, Hamas will, or what, even if Hamas is gone, right, whatever group remains, just because Hamas would go, it wouldn't take away the Palestinians' right or their desire to fight back against this brutal occupation that they all suffer under. Remember, Israel is currently starving hundreds of thousands of children, right? When now a 13-year-old boy or a 5-year-old boy is watching his little sister shrivel up and potentially even die from starvation, you're almost ensuring that you're going to have another generation of young men who are willing to pick up whatever arms they could find and fight you with them, right? There's no, you can't think of a more cruel death for a child than, crying for weeks on end, begging for food, being so hungry, and then finally succumbing to starvation. And Israel's inflicting that on a massive number of Palestinians at this point. And that those cries are going to be the rallying cry for the next Palestinian militant movement in Gaza. And again, they are going to have a lot of weapons at their disposal if Israel leaves. So Israel is going to conduct the ethnic cleansing, in part because they want to, because they want the territory, because they want the Palestinians gone, because this is a demographic issue, because this is a colonization issue. But there's also this military aspect, I think, too, where at this point they're going to feel like they can't leave. And I think there's a pretty good argument that if they do, there's going to be a well-armed force in Gaza. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Israeli strikes in Gaza that landed on a boy onto roof, targeted official release in hostage deal. So an Israeli airstrike that launched a 7-year-old boy onto the roof of a neighboring building in Gaza City killed 15 members of his family, including 5 sisters, targeted a Gaza finance ministry official who was released in a prisoner swap 2 months prior. A video recorded by a Palestinian journalist showed the boy, Ali Faraj, moments after he was blown onto the roof, crying for help. Nearby was his dead father and the pieces of one of his sisters. The footage spread widely on social media, and Ali recounted the experience to journalists. "I was sitting with my father and my sisters were praying. Suddenly our house was bombed," he said. The Israeli military has refused to comment on the slaughter, but Palestinian sources told Haaretz that Faraj's father, Faraj, was likely the target. Faraj was an employee for the Gaza Finance Ministry, and he was detained by Israeli forces shortly after the IDF launched its initial ground invasion in Gaza. And so this is something that I think is important too. And we talked about the bomb thing, but I think we could put that aside here, because very early on in this conflict, the unexploded bombs, I think, would have been far less of an issue for Israel. In November of 2023, there was a ceasefire deal that was going to allow all the Israeli hostages to get released in exchange for the release of some Palestinian hostages and captives and detainees held by Israel, as well as the ending of military operations in Gaza. Now, Israel could say, oh, we don't want to have to make concessions, but these weren't necessarily going to have to be concessions, because if Israel wanted to, they are the dominant power. They are the monopoly on violence in the area. And so even if they release hostages, they could just bomb them or rearrest them later. Even if they leave Gaza, they could come back or they could bomb it later. It didn't have to be right then. And so it was, this I think is just further evidence that it was never about the hostages. It was never about not wanting to make a deal with Hamas. It was about using October 7th and the hostages to inflict as much pain on Gaza as possible, and also, ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, May 5th. Israeli government approves plan for full occupation of Gaza. And so the Israeli government has approved plans to expand the genocidal war in Gaza that Israeli officials say will lead to the full military occupation of the Palestinian territory. So 2 points to make on this. One, we will see how this goes. Israel is relying on a lot of reservists reporting to duty after they received their call-up notices. Tens of thousands of those went out. A lot of the reservists are going to be sent to the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, in order to free up Israeli regular soldiers to go into Gaza and carry out this military occupation. And of course, the second point is this could be extremely deadly for the Israeli soldiers. At this point, again, Hamas is going to have a lot of explosives to use. They have 40,000 fighters, and most of their tunnel network is still in place. All right, let's talk about the latest genocidal remarks from Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister. He said on Tuesday that within a few months, the Gaza Strip will be totally destroyed and the entire Palestinian population will be concentrated into a tiny area in the southern part of the Palestinian territory before being forced to leave as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign. So Smotrich explained, within a few months, we will be able to declare that we have won. Gaza will be totally destroyed. In another 6 months, Hamas won't be a functioning entity. The population in Gaza will be concentrated from the Morag corridor southwards. The rest of the strip will be empty. The Morag corridor refers to the land between the cities of Khan Yunis and Rafah. And then Smotrich added here, the Gazan citizens will be concentrated in the south. They will be totally despairing, understanding that there is no hope and nothing to look for in Gaza, and will be relocation to begin to a new life in other places. The Israeli minister said that the Palestinian population will leave in great numbers to third countries. Throughout Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, Smotrich has been an outspoken proponent of the ethnic cleansing of the territory. And so in his speech on Tuesday, Smotrich also vowed that the current Israeli government would annex the West Bank. He said, it will happen in this term. It is one of our most important challenges, that we are at a historic opportunity. And I do think he is right about that, as horrific as it is. That is the path that we are now going down in Gaza. All right, one more horror story from Gaza before we move on to Yemen. Israeli strike hits school sheltering displaced Palestinians, killing 22. On Tuesday, an Israeli strike hit a UN school turned shelter for displaced Palestinians in central Gaza, killing 22 and wounding 54. Footage of the aftermath of the attack shows many children among the casualties. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, at least 7 children were killed by the strike. Schools sheltering displaced Palestinians have been a frequent target of Israeli strikes in Gaza. The Israeli military typically claims to target Hamas in the attack, but never provides evidence for the claims. So far, there has been no public comment from the Israeli military about the strike. And Gaza's health ministry said in its daily update on Tuesday that Israel killed 48 Palestinians and injured over 142 others over the previous 24-hour period. The relentless Israeli attacks come as Palestinian children are facing starvation due to the U.S.-backed Israeli blockade that's been imposed for over 2 months. The health ministry said that since Israel resumed its genocidal war on March 18th, at least 2,507 Palestinians have been killed and 6,700 were injured. The numbers account for the dead and wounded Palestinians brought to hospitals and morgues only. And so this means that the death toll since October 7th, the official one, is 52,615, and the number of wounded is 118,752. And of course, these are massive undercounts. The number of wounded may be even an undercount of the true number of dead at this point. What Israel is doing in Gaza has been just absolutely horrific. Okay. Next up here, moving on to Yemen, where, as predicted, Israel pummeled the country after an Houthi Ansar Allah missile was able to strike the Ben Gurion airport in Israel. So Israel launches major airstrikes on Yemen after a missile hit Ben Gurion airport. Israel launched major airstrikes in Yemen on Monday that targeted the Red Sea port of Hodeidah and a concrete factory in the same province. Strikes came a day after a Houthi missile struck Israel's Ben Gurion airport. The Israeli military said about 20 of its warplanes took part in the attack and dropped about 50 munitions on the port and the concrete facility. The strikes were launched in coordination with the U.S. It's unclear if any U.S. warplanes directly took part in the Israeli attack, but the U.S. did launch other airstrikes in Yemen on Monday. According to the Saba news agency, a total of 18 U.S. airstrikes targeted the Yemeni capital of Sana'a and the Al-Waf province. Saba also reported that at least 21 people were injured in the attack on the cement factory, which is described as a preliminary toll. The Israeli military took credit for bombing the factory, claiming it serves an important economic resource for the Houthi terror regime and is used for building tunnels and military infrastructure. Israel launched several rounds of airstrikes on Yemen last year, but this attack marks the first time that Israeli military bombed the country under the new Trump administration. Before the missile strike on the Ben Gurion airport, the Trump administration had asked Israel not to respond to Houthi attacks and said that the U.S. forces would handle retaliation. The Trump administration launched its bombing campaign in Yemen on March 15th after the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah, announced they would reimpose a blockade on Israeli shipping in response to Israel violating the ceasefire in Gaza by imposing a total blockade on the Palestinian territory. After Israel completely broke the ceasefire and resumed its genocidal war in Gaza on March 18th, Yemeni forces began firing missiles and drones at Israel despite the U.S. bombing campaign. The U.S. has launched over 1,000 airstrikes in Yemen since March 15th, killing over 200 civilians, but the Houthis remain undeterred. Now, an update on this. Israeli airstrikes pound Yemen for a second day and target the Sana'a airport. So the Israeli military launched heavy airstrikes on Yemen for a second day on Tuesday, targeting the Sana'a International Airport and other infrastructure in the capital. According to Yemeni media, at least 3 people were killed and 38 were wounded in the attack, which targeted the airport, a cement factory, and power plants. The IDF said the strikes on the airport targeted runways, aircraft, and infrastructure and claimed the airport was totally disabled. The IDF claimed the attack on the cement factory constitutes a blow to the regime's economic and military buildup. The Israeli strikes hit Yemen on Monday, targeted the port of Hodeidah and a cement factory, which is also in Hodeidah. According to the Yemeni news agency Saba, the attacks on the port and the cement factory killed at least 4 and wounded 39. The Israeli attacks on Yemen came after the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, successfully attacked the Ben Gurion airport in a missile strike. Now, this is interesting. Trump says U.S. will stop bombing Yemen. President Trump on Tuesday said the U.S. will stop bombing Yemen, claiming the Houthis said they would not be blowing up ships anymore. The president says the Houthis, they don't want to fight anymore, and we will honor that. We will stop the bombing. They have capitulated. We will take the word that they will not be blowing up ships anymore. That's the purpose of what we're doing, Trump said in the Oval Office. A member of Ansar Allah's political bureau said in a statement after the Trump's announcement that the Houthis will stop attacks on U.S. assets in the region if the U.S. stops bombing Yemen, but vowed operations against Israel will continue until there is a ceasefire in Gaza and an end to the blockade on the Palestinian territory. And this strongly suggests to me that it was actually the Americans, Donald Trump, who capitulated to the Houthis. After all, from the very beginning, this was what the Houthis said. They said, we don't have a problem with you. Our problem is with Israel. And if you attack us, we'll attack you. We'll attack American shipping, but our goal is to block Israeli shipping going off of our coast. Our goal is to attack Israel, not the United States of America. And it seems that the Houthis have agreed to that, and then Trump has now called off the American strikes when the American strikes started before the Houthis started attacking American ships and American assets. So, the U.S. strikes don't seem to have any real effect on the Houthis' abilities. I think a part of this is apparently has to do with Iran, that this was mediated by Oman, and this is about trying to set the stage to have better opportunities for diplomacy with the Iranians, since the U.S. blames the Houthis, Iran, for everything that the Houthis do, and claims that, we're going to attack Iran if the Houthis keep doing what they're doing. And so I think this will pave the way and make some ground for potential talks with Iran, although I don't think Trump is going to get a deal done anyways. Now, the last point here is that this has come at substantial cost to the Americans. We're using billions of dollars in bombs and expensive munitions to hit Ansar Allah. We have 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the region, B-2 bombers in Diego Garcia. We are fully ramped up for war in order to strike the Houthis. These are expensive deployments, and it means our ships can't be elsewhere in the world. And additionally, we already lost one F-18 off the side of an aircraft carrier because a Houthi missile apparently got so close to one that it had to take evasive maneuvers to miss it. But it was reported just this morning, just before I went on, that a second fighter jet fell into the Red Sea. And so we're now talking about hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fighter jets, as well as billions of dollars worth of bombs being spent. And I mean, I'm glad that the Houthis are willing to stop attacking the Americans. If the Americans stop attacking them, let's hope this holds. I'm not exactly optimistic at this point, particularly if the Houthis keep striking Israel. Although maybe Trump told Netanyahu, like, you handle the Houthi problem on your own now. I'm done with it. You're bombing them. You could keep bombing them. I just don't care anymore. I'm not going to spend our money to do that. So maybe that's the case. But interesting developments there in Yemen. All right, everybody, that's where I will wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Big things coming up for the rest of the day. I will be on at about 1:30 Eastern time with Robbie the Fire Bernstein on the Run Your Mouth podcast. So very excited about that. I always have a good time talking to Robbie. And of course, the Kyle Anzalone show later today, 4:45 Eastern live. And my guest will be the great Misty Winston. Thanks, everyone.